So, for thousands of years, humans basically believed that the best way to survive this really hostile universe was just to build a thicker wall.
Right, or like forge a sharper sword or something.
Exactly. Or, offer a larger sacrifice to the gods.
Yeah.
If you asked our ancestors, like, what actually kept them alive, they would point to something totally tangible.
Right.
A fortress, right? Or a weapon.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the actual mechanism that ended up, doubling human life expectancy
Yeah.
and mapping the human mind and literally patching a hole in the sky was totally invisible.
Yeah, it wasn't a tool you could actually hold in your hand.
Right. It was just this willingness to look at the world and look at our own really deeply held beliefs and basically say, I am wrong.
Which, I mean, is the single most unnatural thing a human brain can do.
Oh, totally.
Like, our neurology is completely wired for certainty. It's wired for pattern recognition and, tribal consensus.
Right.
Admitting ignorance goes against pretty much every evolutionary instinct we have for social survival. And yet, that exact friction is what built the entire modern world.
And that paradox is exactly what we are dissecting today. So welcome to another deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today, we are working from this really comprehensive source document. It's simply titled understanding.pdf.
It's a great read.
It really is.
Yeah.
And our mission today for you, the listener, is to explore humanity's greatest, most hard-won invention.
And we aren't looking at the wheel here.
Right. No, not the wheel, not the microchip, not even like splitting the atom.
No.
We are looking at the actual process of truth-seeking itself.
Yeah.
Like the architectural blueprint of how humans learn to correct their own mistakes and basically pull themselves out of the dark.
And at the absolute center of this whole exploration is this really profound reframing of what it actually means to seek knowledge.
Yeah.
There is this premise right at the foundation of our source material that kind of redefines the entire concept of science and research.
It's that quote, right?
Yep. Yes. It states, research is one of humanity's most important acts of humility.
Wow.
Right. It all begins with a single, just incredibly vulnerable admission, which is, we do not know enough yet.
I love that so much because it completely flips the stereotype on its head.
It really does.
Like when we think of the scientific method or, academic research, the cultural image is usually one of just extreme arrogance.
Oh, yeah, totally. The rigid expert in the lab coat.
Exactly. Just dictating the laws of the universe from a podium somewhere.
Right.
But to actually practice truth-seeking, to really engage in it, the text argues you have to start from a position of just profound intellectual vulnerability.
You really do.
You have to admit that your intuition is flawed and your traditions might just be based on superstition, and honestly, your own senses are actively lying to you.
Precisely. And to understand the sheer magnitude of that humility, I mean, we really have to look at the epistemological baseline of early humanity.
Right.
We have to look at what it was actually like to survive inside the mystery, before we had any formalized system for asking questions.
Yeah, let's paint that picture.
Because for the vast majority of human history, reality was explained through a very specific set of lenses: myth, religion, tradition, intuition, and just unquestioned authority.
And I think we really need to examine why those frameworks were so dominant.
Definitely.
Because it's super easy from where we sit today, with our smartphones and everything, to look back at ancient myths and just dismiss them as sheer ignorance.
Oh, absolutely.
But those frameworks, they weren't just fairy tales. They were like structural, load-bearing pillars for early societies.
They were survival tools.
Right. Think about it. If a volcano erupts and just destroys your village, the idea that it was caused by, tectonic friction that you can neither see nor control, that is psychologically terrifying.
It leaves you completely powerless.
Yeah, exactly. But if you believe the volcano erupted because the gods are angry, well, suddenly you have this illusion of agency.
Right? You can do something about it.
You can offer a sacrifice. You can change your behavior. I mean, myth provided a really actionable framework for chaos.
And that is a really critical distinction the source makes. Those narratives gave people a sense of moral order.
Yeah.
They provided a shared identity and a mechanism for social cohesion. I mean, when the environment is just brutally unpredictable, having a collective story that explains the terror is a highly effective psychological survival tool.
It keeps everyone bound together, right?
Exactly. It keeps the community functioning in the face of random destruction.
But, and this is the kicker, the reality underneath all that psychological comfort was just absolutely brutal.
Oh, yeah.
Like, the environment was still totally dictating the terms of existence. Disease spread invisibly, and because literally no one understood microbial transmission, it just looked like a literal curse moving through a population.
Which is terrifying.
So terrifying.
Yeah.
And crops failed without warning, triggering these cascading famines. Natural disasters were, like we said, interpreted as divine retribution.
So you didn't just lose your home, you believed the universe fundamentally hated you.
Yes. And when it comes to mental illness, I mean, the text points out this is perhaps the darkest corner of the mystery.
Without a doubt.
The suffering there was compounded by such profound misunderstanding. Severe psychological distress was routinely categorized as, like, demonic possession or just a failure of moral character.
And the psychological toll of that pervasive uncertainty is really difficult for the modern mind to fully grasp.
It really is.
Tragedies that we would classify today as catastrophic emergencies, things requiring immediate global intervention, they were simply accepted as the baseline rhythm of existence.
Just normal life.
Right. The loss of multiple children to common infections, the devastation of maternal mortality during childbirth, dying from a minor scratch that got infected.
Oh, yeah.
These were not anomalies. They were just the expected parameters of life.
Wow.
And even the rigid social hierarchies of the time, the systems that kept the vast majority of human beings in extreme poverty, they were treated as sacred, immovable laws of nature.
Right, because you couldn't dismantle a feudal system if you fundamentally believed it was ordained by the cosmos.
Exactly.
It's kind of like, imagine playing a really high-stakes video game where you just don't know the rules.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Right. The controls are totally hidden. You push a button, and sometimes you get food. You push the exact same button the next day, and the console randomly catches fire.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was like.
You have absolutely no idea about the internal wiring or the circuitry or the rules governing any of the outputs. You are just absorbing the impacts of this invisible architecture that was early human existence, just surviving inside a mystery.
And that raises the ultimate historical question from our source material. How does a species trapped inside that closed loop of mystery manage to break out?
Right. Because it wasn't magic.
No, and it wasn't the result of a sudden biological mutation either.
Yeah.
You didn't just suddenly evolve a new lobe in the brain that perfectly understood physics.
That would have been convenient, but no.
Right. The transition was entirely driven by a shift in epistemology. It was a shift in the specific nature of the questions we were willing to ask.
The pivot from asking who is in charge to asking what is the mechanism.
Well, what's fascinating here is it's even more fundamental than that.
Oh, yeah.
The trajectory of human civilization fundamentally fractured and branched off in a new direction when we stopped asking, who says this is true, and began asking, how do we know?
How do we know? Wow. Let's just sit with the friction of that question for a second.
It's massive.
Because when the dominant authority, whether that's a monarch or a religious institution or simply 1,000 years of unbroken tradition, when they say the sun orbits the earth,
Right.
asking, how do we know, is an act of profound aggression against the status quo. I mean, it's an epistemological earthquake.
It is deeply destabilizing because what you are actually saying is that authority alone is insufficient to dictate reality.
Yeah.
And that is the genesis of the scientific method. It wasn't just the invention of a new tool. The text argues it was the invention of a behavioral technology.
Behavioral technology, I like that.
It took the raw, chaotic human instinct of curiosity and forced it through a really disciplined, rigid filter. Observation, hypothesis, testing, gathering physical evidence.
And then, the most painful step of all, peer criticism and revision.
Yeah, that last step is crucial.
That peer criticism part is where the real magic and the real pain actually happens. Because it's one thing to come up with a brilliant hypothesis in your own head.
Sure.
It is entirely another thing to hand your life's work to a group of skeptics and basically say, hey, tear this apart.
It takes a lot of guts.
It does.
Yeah.
The ultimate breakthrough wasn't a single brilliant realization. It was humanity slowly learning to construct systems that asked, what specific evidence would prove my theory completely wrong?
And that is the architectural core of self-correction.
Yeah.
Karl Popper famously formalized this much later as falsifiability, but the concept was brewing for centuries.
Right.
If a claim cannot be tested and potentially proven false, it just isn't a robust piece of knowledge. You are building a system where the highest intellectual virtue is not defending your thesis to the death.
Right, which is what we usually want to do.
Exactly. The virtue is actively seeking the data that destroys it so you can build something stronger in its place.
And this wasn't just some isolated phenomenon. This shift didn't happen in a single laboratory in a single century.
No, not at all.
To really understand the scale of this invention, the document shows we have to look at this multi-generational global relay race that made it possible.
And this requires an enormous amount of context.
It does, because the narrative we usually get in school is incredibly compressed.
The historical reality is vastly more complex and collaborative than the standard Western-centric timeline usually suggests. The foundation of truth-seeking was built piece by piece, across vastly different geographies and epochs.
So let's break down that global relay race, because the specific contributions are just fascinating.
Where should we start?
Well, the source starts in places like ancient Mesopotamia.
Okay.
We often think of them just, looking at the stars and inventing astrology.
Yeah.
But the actual intellectual leap was the realization of predictive models.
Right, finding the patterns.
Exactly. They realized the universe wasn't just governed by the random moves of river gods. There were mathematical patterns to the celestial bodies.
Which is huge.
Right. If you can predict an eclipse, you have suddenly proven that reality operates on a fixed track.
And that realization of a mechanistic universe is the first necessary step.
Yeah.
Then you look at early Egyptian civilization. Alongside their immense structural engineering, there is a really profound engagement with practical problem solving.
Oh, like with medicine.
Yeah. Through practices that were initially religious, like mummification, they inadvertently developed a highly sophisticated, localized knowledge of human anatomy.
That makes a lot of sense.
And even rudimentary surgical intervention. They were cataloging the actual physical reality of the human body.
Okay, so then the relay baton passes to the Greeks, right?
Right.
And they take this observational data and they formalize the logic. They invent the axiomatic method.
Which is a massive leap.
It is. They decide that you can start with a self-evident truth, an axiom, and use pure, rigorous logic to deduce further complex truths that literally cannot be debated.
Yeah.
They basically built the conceptual scaffolding for mathematical proofs and philosophical debate.
But, and this is important, the Greeks had a significant blind spot.
They did.
They heavily favored pure deduction and often really disdained manual experimentation.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they kind of thought you could figure out the universe just by thinking about it perfectly in a room.
Just sitting there and philosophizing.
Exactly. So to move past that, you really need the massive influx of conceptual tools from India and China.
Right. This is where the mathematical tool set gets exponentially more powerful. Because, you cannot build modern science without the concept of zero.
No, you can't.
Which emerges from Indian mathematics. Try doing complex calculus or balancing chemical equations using Roman numerals.
It's literally impossible.
It is. You need a placeholder for nothing to make complex algorithms function.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, China is advancing empirical observations in astronomy. They're developing the earliest forms of the compass.
And paper making.
Yes, paper making, which totally democratizes the storage of information. And they're building these highly complex systems of statecrafts and ethics that actually rely on meritocratic testing rather than just pure bloodline succession.
And then we reach a crucial, often underappreciated nexus in this global relay race, which is the Islamic Golden Age.
This part of the text was so illuminating.
It really is. During a period when European institutional learning had severely contracted, Islamic scholars did not merely act as passive librarians, just hoarding Greek texts.
Right, they weren't just babysitting the book.
Exactly. They actively synthesized, rigorously criticized, and profoundly expanded upon the knowledge of antiquity.
And this is a perfect example of that. How do we know mechanism in action?
Yes, let's look at optics.
Okay, optics. For centuries, the prevailing Greek theory, championed by thinkers like Ptolemy, was the emission theory of vision.
Right.
They fundamentally believed that the human eye worked like a flashlight, that we emitted beams of light that bounced off objects and returned to us, and that's what allowed us to see.
Which honestly logically makes sense if you are just thinking about it in a dark room.
Yeah, totally.
If you close your eyes, the world goes dark. If you open them, the world appears. So the intuitive leap is that the eye is projecting the reality.
Right, but intuition is flawed.
Yeah.
And then you have Islamic polymaths like Ibn al-Haytham, known in the West as El-Hisan.
Right.
He steps in and refuses to just accept the Greek authority. He doesn't just philosophize a camera argument. He built actual physical experiments.
The camera obscura.
Yes. He uses the camera obscura, a dark room with a tiny pinhole, to mathematically prove that light travels in straight lines from external sources, bounces off objects, and then enters the eye.
It's brilliant.
He completely inverted the mechanics of human perception through verifiable physical testing. He literally proved the Greeks wrong with math and shadows.
And that specific methodology, requiring empirical proof to validate a mathematical model, that is the vital bridge to the later European scientific revolution.
Yeah.
The European institutions that eventually formalized specialized scientific disciplines, the ones that built the modern university systems and standardized experimental review,
Right.
they were standing directly on the shoulders of that Islamic synthesis.
And I think it's really crucial to recognize the actual labor force behind this evolution.
Oh, definitely.
Because the history books, they tend to only highlight the solitary geniuses.
Right.
The Newtons, the Galileos, the Einsteins.
Yeah.
But the document stresses that the process of truth-seeking is an inherently communal architecture.
It takes a village.
It required armies of obscure working-class contributors, monks copying manuscripts in freezing monasteries, translators meticulously converting Arabic texts into Latin.
Right, nurses.
Yes, nurses making vital statistical observations about patient mortality on crowded wards, the archivists, the glassblowers who made the lenses for the first microscope.
The sailors mapping the coastlines.
Exactly. It was a massive collective behavioral shift.
It really reveals that the scientific method is fundamentally a social enterprise. A solitary genius cannot engage in peer review.
By definition, yeah.
Truth-seeking requires a community willing to share data, debate findings, and agree on the actual rules of evidence.
But, okay, let's introduce a massive structural problem here.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Because this entire narrative of a global relay race sounds incredibly noble. It sounds like a beautiful, collaborative utopia, like humanity naturally interlocking hands across centuries to build a grand cathedral of knowledge.
Right.
But wasn't challenging authority incredibly dangerous? Like, proving reality wrong wasn't just an academic exercise back then, was it?
No, it was an act of political treason. The epistemological friction we discussed earlier, it has a real-world body count. The pursuit of empirical truth was historically one of the most dangerous occupations a human being could undertake.
Wow.
The risks were multidimensional. First, there were just the physical dangers inherent to the research itself.
Like what?
Well, to understand anatomy, early anatomists had to engage in grave robbing, risking disease, and execution.
Oh, true.
To understand epidemiology, researchers had to intentionally immerse themselves in cholera outbreaks or plague wards.
That's terrifying.
They were exploring hostile environments without any of the protective paradigms we rely on today.
So the physical risks are terrifying, obviously, but the social and political dangers were often far more lethal.
Absolute.
Because truth-seeking inevitably creates profound discomfort. It threatens identity, it threatens tradition, and most importantly, it threatens power.
Yeah, consider the structural dynamics of certainty. Certainty is a highly effective mechanism for social control. If a political or religious institution claims a monopoly on absolute truth, their power is unquestionable.
Right.
When an astronomer points a telescope at Jupiter and maps the orbits of its moons, proving that not everything in the universe revolves around the Earth,
Yeah.
they aren't just making a celestial observation. They are quietly suggesting that the entire cosmological hierarchy, which underpins the social hierarchy of kings and priests, might be fundamentally incorrect.
And that is exactly why Galileo was put under house arrest by the Inquisition.
Exactly.
He wasn't punished for doing math. He was punished for the political implications of his math.
Right.
And honestly, he got off relatively easy compared to others who were burned at the stake for proposing infinite universes or questioning the literal interpretations of ancient texts.
He was brutal.
The authorities recognized instinctively that if you teach people to demand evidence for the movement of the planets, well, it won't be long before they start demanding evidence for the divine right of kings.
Yeah, the individuals who participated in this global relay race faced systemic ridicule, total censorship, brutal imprisonment, and execution.
Yeah.
And yet, the process survived. The behavioral technology of asking, how do we know, proved more resilient than the institutions trying to suppress it.
And think about the immense luxury we have today. You, the listener, the very fact that you can sit and listen to an intellectual deep dive like this today.
It's amazing.
The fact that we have the freedom to question established narratives, to demand empirical evidence from our leaders, and to change our minds based on new data.
Right.
That entire framework of intellectual liberty is a direct inheritance. It was paid for in blood and ostracization by generations of people who decided that a terrifying truth was fundamentally more valuable than a comforting lie.
Which naturally brings us to the most pragmatic question of all, really.
Which is?
If humanity took all these risks, if we violently dismantled our comforting myths, if we endured centuries of epistemological friction to build this massive self-correcting machine, what did it actually yield? What are the tangible, measurable receipts of this progress?
Right. Here's where it gets really interesting, because this is where we transition from abstract philosophy to the hard, undeniable metrics of human survival.
Yeah, the data.
Because the transformation of the human experience isn't just a matter of opinion, it is mathematically verifiable. Let's look at the baseline metric of existence, global life expectancy.
The numbers are just staggering when you view them across the full timeline of human history.
They really are.
For millennia, global life expectancy hovered in the low 30s. Even as late as 1900, the global average was around 32 years.
32 years, that's so young.
Right. But by 2023, that average had surged to approximately 73 years.
We more than doubled the human lifespan in a little over a single century. I mean, that is a biological miracle engineered through accumulated research.
And we must be precise about the mechanisms driving that jump. Because it wasn't just that humans suddenly stopped aging. The dramatic rise in life expectancy is heavily tied to the catastrophic rates of early mortality that were finally brought under control.
Right.
Which leads us to probably the most emotionally resonant metric of all, child mortality.
Yeah, this part of the text hit me hard. For the vast majority of human existence, the brutal statistical reality was that roughly half of all children born would not survive to see their 15th birthday.
It's hard to even fathom.
The 50%, that was the baseline parameter of the human family.
Think about the psychological architecture of a society forced to live with that statistic.
Yeah.
Every single family, regardless of wealth or status, existed in a state of perpetual looming grief.
Right.
The emotional defenses required to function in a world where you expect half your children to die of dysentery, measles, or just minor infections, they must have been profound.
But the process of truth-seeking completely dismantled that reality. By 2020, that historical 50% mortality rate had fallen to roughly 4%.
That's incredible.
And the momentum continues. Globally, the under 5 mortality rate plummeted by an incredible 59% just between 1990 and 2023, dropping from 93 deaths per 1,000 live births to just 37.
But we need to look closely at how that happened.
Right. It wasn't magic.
No, it wasn't a sudden magical revelation. It was the result of a grueling, often heavily resisted paradigm shift known as germ theory.
Oh, yes. That is a perfect example of the friction we discussed earlier.
It really is.
In the mid-19th century, before germ theory was established, hospitals were essentially death traps.
Pretty much.
And you had a physician named Ignaz Semmelweis working in a maternity clinic in Vienna. He observed that women were dying of childbed fever at a drastically higher rate in the clinic staffed by doctors than in the clinic staffed by midwives.
Right. And Semmelweis engaged the scientific method.
He did.
He observed, he formed a hypothesis, and he tested. He noticed that doctors were frequently moving directly from performing autopsies on diseased corpses to delivering babies without washing their hands.
Oh, gross.
Yeah, and the midwives did not perform autopsies. So he theorized that some invisible, quote-unquote, cadaverous particles were being transferred. So he institutes a strict hand-washing protocol using a chlorine solution, and the mortality rate immediately plummets.
He had the data. He proved his hypothesis and saved lives.
Yeah.
You would think the medical establishment would throw a parade for him.
You would think so.
But what actually happened?
They rejected him entirely. The epistemological friction was just too great. The prevailing medical authority held that diseases were caused by miasmas, like bad air, or imbalances in the body's humors.
Right.
Furthermore, the physicians, who were, upper-class gentlemen, they were deeply insulted by the implication that their hands could be considered unclean, or that they were the vectors of death for their own patients.
Though their egos got in the way.
Exactly. The social status of the doctors acted as a barrier to the truth. Semmelweis was ridiculed, his contracts were not renewed, and he eventually died in a psychiatric asylum after a severe mental breakdown.
It's so sad.
It is, and it was heavily driven by the rejection of his life-saving discovery.
It is a heartbreaking story, but it perfectly illustrates the central thesis. The human brain resists correction.
Yes.
But because the scientific method is a decentralized, cumulative relay race, the truth eventually forces its way through.
Eventually, yes.
Decades later, Figures like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch provided the rigorous microbiological proof of germ theory, vindicating Semmelweis's core observation.
The resistance just crumbled under the overwhelming weight of verifiable data.
Right, and the result of that incredibly painful paradigm shift is literally millions of children surviving into adulthood.
And that survival rate triggers a massive cascade of secondary effects.
Oh, for sure.
Because when families are no longer defined by the constant terror of infant death and epidemic disease, the entire structure of human ambition shifts.
Yeah.
Which brings us to another fundamental metric from the document, which is literacy.
Right. 200 years ago, the ability to read and write was a highly specialized, tightly guarded skill. Only about 12% of the global population was literate. Information was basically a monopoly held by the clergy and the extreme elite.
Yeah.
But today, more than 80% of the world's population is literate. 4 out of 5 human beings have access to the decentralized network of human thought.
Though, we must maintain our intellectual honesty here.
Right, of course.
We are not describing a finished utopia. UNESCO notes that over 739 million adults globally still lack basic literacy skills.
Which is a lot.
The work of democratizing knowledge remains incomplete, but the trajectory is undeniably revolutionary.
I mean, when you combine doubled life expectancy, plunging child mortality, and mass literacy, you arrive at something much larger than just physical survival.
What do you mean?
You were talking about the massive expansion of raw human potential.
Exactly. For most of history, human cognition was entirely monopolized by the immediate demands of physical survival.
Getting through the day.
Right. You spent your entire caloric and mental energy securing the next meal, surviving the winter, and fighting off illness. But when a society utilizes accumulated research to solve those baseline biological mysteries, when you invent modern sanitation, robust agricultural yields, antibiotics, and refrigeration, you suddenly liberate millions of human minds.
You buy time. The ultimate receipt of progress is time.
It really is.
When you don't have to spend 12 hours a day hauling clean water because hydraulic engineering does it for you, you have the bandwidth to actually imagine.
Yeah.
You can create complex art, formulate political philosophy, compose symphonies, and design digital architecture.
Exactly.
We take everyday miracles for granted. The weather forecasting models that predict hurricanes weeks in advance, the logistics networks that ensure that grocery stores are stocked, they are the invisible infrastructure that allows civilization to actually blossom.
But, and there is a big but here, the liberation of human potential introduces a profoundly dangerous variable into the equation.
Okay, let's go there.
The capacity to manipulate reality is not inherently benevolent. Knowledge is power, but it is not morality. Once humanity learns how to understand, classify, predict, and control the mechanisms of the universe, we are immediately confronted with terrifying ethical questions like, should we? Who benefits? Who is harmed?
Yeah, this is where we have to confront the dark side of the narrative. Because if we are intellectually honest, we have to admit that truth-seeking is a double-edged sword.
It absolutely is.
Let me push back hard on the idea that science is just the undisputed hero of the human story.
Okay, let's unpack this.
If we look at the 20th century, the most advanced application of accumulated knowledge wasn't just used to cure polio. It was used to build industrialized slaughterhouses during the World Wars.
Yeah.
It was used to develop chemical weapons. Nuclear physics gave us a massive new energy source, sure, but it also gave us the capacity to vaporize entire cities and potentially end human history in an afternoon.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, your pushback is entirely valid and absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
The source material is explicit on this point. We must not confuse technological advancement with moral elevation. The tools of research have been routinely hijacked to justify atrocious human behavior. Biological sciences were deeply corrupted in the 19th and 20th centuries to provide pseudoscientific justifications for racism and the catastrophic policies of eugenics.
And it isn't just about the physical weapons or biological manipulation either. It's about the systems of control.
What do you mean?
Well, we built incredible data collection capabilities to track disease and manage economies. But that exact same data infrastructure is currently used to build unprecedented surveillance states.
That's very true.
Psychology mapped the human mind to heal trauma. But those exact same behavioral insights are currently deployed by algorithms designed to manipulate consumer behavior or radicalized political factions.
Furthermore, we have to look at the structural failures of the institutions of knowledge themselves.
Okay.
Because for centuries, the academies and universities claiming to map universal truth, they actively excluded women, colonized populations, and minority groups from participating in the research. When you exclude the vast majority of human experience from the process of truth-seeking, the truth you produce is inherently distorted. It becomes a tool to reinforce existing power dynamics rather than dismantle them.
So how do we reconcile this?
It's the big question.
If the exact same methodology that gave us antibiotics also gave us systemic exploitation, biased data, and weapons of mass destruction, is it actually the hero of our story? Or did we just build a bigger monster?
Yeah.
We moved from fearing invisible demons to fearing nuclear annihilation. That doesn't feel like a clean victory.
Well, the text argues it isn't a clean victory. The ethical goal of civilizational progress is not purity, it is accountability.
Accountability, okay.
If we demand that knowledge must only ever produce flawless, perfectly moral outcomes, we will inevitably fall into absolute despair. Because humans are fundamentally flawed operators. But cynical reductionism, the argument that all research is just a tool for domination, that all institutions are inherently corrupt, and that progress is just an illusion masking deeper exploitation, the document says that's intellectually lazy.
It's a very seductive trap, though. Cynicism feels like intellectual maturity. It feels smart to point out the flaws in everything.
It does feel smart, but it requires you to actively erase the very real reduction in human suffering.
Yeah.
A purely cynical view requires you to look at a mother whose child survived a bacterial infection because of antibiotics and say, well, the system is fundamentally corrupt.
Right.
A mature worldview requires the cognitive endurance to hold two contradictory truths simultaneously. Research has caused profound harm and created existential risks. A&D research has orchestrated the greatest reduction in physical suffering in the history of the planet.
We have to hold the tension. I'd love for you, the listener, to reflect on this tension too. How do you balance the incredible tools in your pocket with the awareness of how those tools are sometimes made or used?
It's a vital reflection.
Because the tools we build are morally neutral amplifiers of human intent. The text points out that responsibility scales linearly with knowledge.
Right.
The more you understand about the mechanics of reality, the deeper your ethical obligation becomes. Humanity requires knowledge to be permanently fused with ethics.
Exactly.
The most humane application of research occurs when it is aggressively transparent, constantly self-correcting, radically inclusive of diverse perspectives, and fiercely anchored to the concept of human dignity.
And that requirement for ethics and care applies not just to how we treat each other, but how we view the physical world around us and the internal world within us.
Yeah.
If we want to see where this ethical application of knowledge has been most transformative, we have to look at the rise of psychology, sociology, and ecology.
Let's explore that internal world first, the mapping of the human mind, the fields of psychology and sociology.
Yeah, this is a huge shift.
For thousands of years, if someone was suffering from crippling anxiety, deep depression, or the aftermath of extreme violence, there was no structural language to explain what was happening to them.
No, they were just considered broken.
Exactly. They were simply broken. The prevailing question was always, what is inherently wrong with me?
And psychology and sociology shifted the entire vector of that question.
How so?
They gave people a language for silent suffering. Trauma, addiction, grief, bias, inequality. They moved the inquiry from what is wrong with you to what happened to you and what structural patterns are influencing you and what specific interventions can actually be changed.
Let me try an analogy to explain the mechanics of this shift.
Let's hear it.
Before we had psychological and sociological frameworks, trying to manage human behavior was kind of like walking around a haunted house in the pitch black.
Okay.
You're just getting hit by invisible things. You're observing the glitch, the depression, the addiction, the societal pressure, and you're just getting battered by it without seeing it.
Right.
Psychology and sociology basically turned on the lights. The ghosts are still there, obviously. People still suffer. But now they have names. Trauma, addiction, systemic inequality. And once you can actually name them, you can deal with them.
That is a very apt comparison. You are transitioning from treating symptoms in the dark to actually having access to the underlying code.
Exactly. We finally have the operating manual. We can look at the circuitry and realize, this isn't a fundamental failure of the person. This is a trauma loop. This is an addiction pathway triggered by environmental stress. This is a behavioral glitch caused by systemic poverty.
Yeah.
We finally have names for the invisible forces operating inside us. We developed therapies, trauma-informed care models, early childhood interventions. We stopped just stumbling in the dark.
And that shift in the internal landscape mirrors a massive shift in how we interact with the external landscape. Our relationship with nature underwent a parallel transformation.
Mhm.
Historically, research shifted humanity's relationship with nature from viewing it as this unpredictable, hostile opponent to an interconnected ecological system.
Yeah, nature was always seen as something to conquer.
Exactly. Endlessly extracted from. It was seen as too vast to be fundamentally damaged by human activity.
Just meaningless background scenery.
Right. But ecological research, biology, and climate science revealed a terrifyingly different reality. They proved that the biosphere is not an infinite backdrop. It is a highly sensitive, deeply interconnected, finite system. And crucially, it is a system that we have the capacity to destabilize.
Which is a heavy realization.
It expands our ethical responsibility to an unprecedented scale.
Mm.
When you understand a system deeply, it increases your appreciation for it. We are forced to transition from conquerors to caretakers.
And it's really easy to look at the current state of the climate and feel absolute despair.
It is.
But the text gives a specific historical case study that proves we are actually capable of this kind of global caretaking. It involves the ozone layer.
Oh, this is one of the most hopeful pieces of the source material.
Yeah, walk us through it.
The story of the recovery of the ozone layer is vital proof of concept. In the mid-20th century, humanity invented chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs.
Right.
They were considered a miracle chemical. Non-toxic, non-flammable, and incredibly stable. They were used in everything from refrigeration to hairspray.
But their stability was actually the trap, right?
Exactly. Because they didn't break down in the lower atmosphere, they drifted all the way up to the stratosphere. And in the 1970s, researchers utilizing the scientific method, specifically Mario Molina and F. Sherwood Rowland, hypothesized that once these CFCs were hit by intense ultraviolet radiation, they would break apart.
And release chlorine.
Yes, and actively destroy the ozone molecules that protect the Earth from lethal solar radiation.
They observed a mechanism that was completely invisible to the naked eye, occurring miles above the surface of the Earth, threatening the biological viability of the entire planet.
And initially, they faced massive friction from industrial authorities who did not want to lose billions of dollars restricting CFCs based on some invisible atmospheric theory.
But the self-correcting machine worked.
It did.
The evidence became overwhelming. Satellite data confirmed a massive hole in the ozone layer over Antarctica. And what happened next is the part we really need to remember. Humanity didn't just shrug and accept the end of the world.
No, we acted.
Through the Montreal Protocol in 1987, international governments, scientific institutions, and global industries coordinated an unprecedented agreement to systematically phase out the production of CFCs.
And the mechanism responded exactly as the models predicted. By removing the destructive variable, the complex system of the atmosphere began to heal.
Wow.
The ozone layer is currently on track to fully recover. It is verifiable proof that governments, science, and industry can cooperate. We literally patched a hole in the sky.
Okay, so let me just get this straight. Let's pause and look at the ledger here. We have doubled the average human lifespan. We have drastically mapped the invisible mechanisms of disease. We developed the operating manual for human psychology to alleviate internal suffering. And we proved we can coordinate globally to literally repair the external atmosphere.
It is an astonishing resume for our species.
So, why does it feel like the world is ending every time I check my phone?
That is the big question, isn't it?
I mean, if the metrics of human survival and capacity have improved this drastically, why is the dominant cultural mood one of overwhelming anxiety, pervasive cynicism, and a belief that humanity is entirely doomed? If things are fundamentally better, why do we feel so much worse?
That dissonance is the subject of a fascinating psychological and sociological intersection in the text.
Okay.
The disconnect between the data of progress and the feeling of collapse is not an accident. It is a direct result of our evolutionary wiring colliding with modern information architecture.
So what does this all mean? Let's break down the evolutionary mismatch.
Well, the mind is built to notice danger faster than safety. It evolved over hundreds of thousands of years in an environment where missing a subtle cue of danger meant instant death.
Right.
If you were a hominid on the savannah and you failed to notice a predator, you were dead. If you failed to notice a beautiful sunset, no survival consequences. Therefore, our neurology is fundamentally biased toward threat detection.
So negative information processes faster, hits harder, and is retained longer.
Exactly. Bad news feels urgent. Good news is gradual. Now take that ancient threat-obsessed neurology and plug it into a 247 global digital media network.
Oh boy.
Outrage spreads faster because it creates emotional urgency and tribal alignment.
It's the perfect storm. The slow, incremental accumulation of positive data is mathematically massive but emotionally inert.
Right.
But a single scandal is immediate. People notice the one hospital mistake over millions of successful routine treatments.
And because our perception of the world is largely mediated by screens highlighting these failures, our collective self-image becomes severely distorted, which leads to a very specific cognitive bias. We start romanticizing the past. The text has this great warning. It says, the past often survives culturally as mood rather than reality.
Memory edits suffering.
Exactly.
It's like applying an Instagram filter to the dark ages. We long for a simpler time that never actually existed. We look at a medieval village and think it looks cozy, until you remember the famine, the rigid hierarchies, and the illiteracy.
We inherit history as an emotional aesthetic rather than a lived reality. And when we only see modern failure measured against a fake historical utopia, cynicism masquerades as intellectual maturity.
And hope is dismissed as naivety.
Right. But the text emphasizes that acknowledging progress isn't complacency. Healthy societies need both gratitude and responsibility.
So how do we maintain our balance?
We resolve this through a framework the text introduces as civilizational stewardship.
Civilizational stewardship.
Yes, the healthiest form of pride is understanding that humanity, despite its brutality, is capable of extraordinary moral learning and cooperation.
Progress isn't about omniscience or perfection. It's about correction. It's the ultimate act of refusing to remain helpless before mystery. It is humanity saying, we may be wrong, but we can learn.
And inheriting this progress brings responsibility. We must protect truth-seeking from propaganda, arrogance, and despair, joining curiosity with conscience.
Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey from the deep past to the modern day. We started with ancestors terrified of invisible demons and ended with humans mapping the genome.
It's quite the ride.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, lingering thought. If our ancestors were completely blind to things like germs, the psychological impacts of trauma, and the cosmic scale of the stars, what profound fundamental truths about reality are we currently completely blind to today?
It's a wild thought.
And more importantly, what kind of rigorous, patient questioning will it take for us to finally see them? Thank you for going on this deep dive with us. Keep questioning, keep testing your assumptions, and keep exploring.